Hello everyone, and welcome to today's session on toggle buttons. Now, a toggle button is simply a switch that has more than one state. So for example, at home, your light switch is a toggle button allowing you to switch something on or off. A toggle button can actually have more than two states, but for today's discussion, I'm going to really show you how Squirrel allows you to create toggle buttons using the standard objects. So on my screen you can see I have three options, and the buttons generally look the same. So if I click it, it switches the picture off, and likewise for option 3 and likewise for option 2. So they all do the same thing, but even though they look the same, besides the color, I've actually used different components to create them. So let's take a look at how that's done. Let's start off with option 1. Which is a button. Now, what you don't see is that, in fact, this is two separate buttons. So I'm just going to shift this down so you can see that there are two. The buttons that I'm using are the push button, which is a standard object provided by Squirrel. Squirrel doesn't actually offer a button called a toggle button, and if you came from business objects development, you'll remember the toggle button that existed in that platform. So this option 1 is essentially the easiest one to create. It doesn't require any form of formula in your spreadsheet at all. The way that the button works simply is it has a source data. So if you look in my spreadsheet, it has a source data, and when you click on the button, it simply moves whatever that value is into the destination. And the destination is then what is used to trigger whether the picture is on and off. So for example, when it's set to 0 and I click and go to my picture, you'll see that it's dynamically visible when the value is equal to 0. When it's equal to 1, in other words it's off, this wouldn't be true, and therefore the picture wouldn't be visible. So in this way, you simply have two buttons. The one button takes the 0 and it moves it to the status. And the second button does exactly the same thing. The only difference is that it takes the 1 in my source set of data and it moves it to the status. In other words, they operate completely separately by simply moving either the 0 or the 1 into the status box. So that's pretty simple, and of course the way that you make it look like a single button is that you need to make them invisible based on their status. So in the turn on status, again, you will see that it's dynamically visible. It's only visible when the status is equal to 1. In other words, when the picture is off, I want to show the turn on button. And likewise, when the status equals 0, in other words it's on, then I want to be able to show the off button option. So these turn on and off based on the number that appears in the status block. And of course, to make it look like it's a single button, you simply are making sure that they are aligned on top of each other. So quite simple. So when we preview it, it's turn off and turn on, and it looks like one toggle button, but it's in fact two different buttons. Okay, let's look at option 2. Option 2 is a little bit different in that it only uses a single push button. And by the way, just as an aside, for those of you who are new to development in dashboards and particularly Squirrel, make sure that you name your components. It can get very overwhelming when you have 50 or 100 or 200 or 300 components and you're trying to find the one that you're trying to adapt. So get into the habit of naming them and giving them appropriate names. It's a lot easier, believe me. I've made that mistake over many years. Okay, so back to option 2. Option 2 has got some formulas associated with them as well. And it uses a single object, and it still has a source. So if we look at the source code, there's a source, and it has a destination as well. In other words, I'm moving it to the status of here. So it works exactly the same way as the previous button. The only difference that I've done with this one is that I've also made the button label variable. And that's because I'm only using a single object. So when it changes status, I need to be able to change the label so the reader or the user knows what to do. So in this case, it's just simply taking the button text and associating it with this cell here, D4. Now, how do I change the data every time I click the button? Well, in this case, we are using one of the functions that Squirrel provides. And I've called mine toggle switch. And what toggle switch does is it allows you to move data. This is a data mover function, allows you to move data from one position to another. It's very handy, and I've actually said this is one of the real strengths inside Squirrel. So in my cell D6 and D7, these two cells are the data that I'm moving into D3 and D4 every time the button changes its status. So you'll see that I have two series within this, and that's because when the status equals 0, I want it to move a set of data into 3 and 4, and when it changes its status to something else, I want it to move a different set of data into that space. So how does it do that? Well, again, it's a very simple process that needs to happen. It basically says, what's the source data that you want to move, and where do you want to move it to? And what's the condition when that data will move? And that's quite important. So when it's set to off, the status, which is this F3, when that value turns to 1, it will then move this data into 3 and 4. And likewise, the reverse, when the value equals 0, it will also move this data into 3 and 4. You might say, is that the same data? No, it's not. There is actually a formula in here. And another tip for new users, get familiar to using particular colors in your spreadsheets. So for example, I use yellow just to understand that that's where a piece of data is sitting. But if there's a formula behind something, I use a different color like the turquoise you've seen here. So in this case, I have a formula that says, I want to be able to move this piece of data to D3, but it changes. So depending on the value over here, it's either going to be a 1 or a 0. And likewise, my turn on or turn off is based on the status in F3. So if it's 0, then I want the label to say turn off. If it's 1, in other words, it's off, I want to be able to change it to say turn on. So it's a simple if statement in Excel, nothing complex. But that data is moved based on these two data mover or series that I've set up. So again, very simple. You don't see anything. The benefit of this is that you're only using one object, which is something that you should strive to do. Strive to use as less objects as possible. That saves space, and it certainly will make sure that your board that you're creating is actually operating with speed. So if we look at that one, again, it's just one single button that's turning on and turning off using the data move capability, and that's a really strong function, and I encourage you. This example may not necessarily be bringing out the true value of a data move function, but believe me, once you get into developing some more complex boards, you'll understand the value of being able to shift data and move data. Okay, the third option that I've looked at is a little bit different. It is exactly the same, I guess, as option 2 in that it only uses one object or one component, which is the button, and it does exactly the same thing, except that I'm using all formulas to change the status of the button. So again, it has a source, and you'll see that there's actually now a formula in that source, and it's related to the 0, or it's related to the status. So if the status equals 0, I want to always change that to a 1, otherwise it'll be a 0. In other words, every time the status changes, the reverse number will be in C3. So meaning every time I click the button, it's going to move either a 1 or a 0 into the E3 space. Likewise, the button label is also dynamic in that there's a formula around it. Again, it's linked to the actual button over here, as you can see in terms of the button text, and it's exactly the same concept. So if the status equals 0, I want that text to be to say turn off, and if it's a 1, I want it to effectively say turn on. So very simple, nothing complex about it, but the benefit is, again, you're using a single object and it simply adjusts the text based on a formula. And in this case, I've used some color changes as well. So by simply adjusting the color status, if I look at the format of the button, if I look at the standard button, I just need to find that. Pressed state, nope. The default state, there it is. You'll see that I've linked the full color to that cell, and again, it's a formula. If E3 equals 0, in other words, it's on, I want it to be a certain color, and if it's off, it'll be the alternative color. So again, when you turn it on and off, you'll see that it changes color as well as switches on or off the picture. Okay, so there you have it, 3 different options of creating toggle buttons. Very simple, one being just 2 buttons that you essentially connect to visibility, either on or off. The second option uses the data move function, which is very powerful. And the third option also only uses one object and simply uses formulas to adjust the text and the color and link to the on-off of the picture. So I hope that has helped. Good luck and see you next time.